There are moments in life when time seems to stop, when the world around you blurs and all that remains is you, and a heavy silence pressing on your chest. That night, our 25th wedding anniversary was supposed to be a celebration, a milestone marking a lifetime shared with Daniel, filled with laughter, memories, and love that had withstood 2.5 decades. Instead, it became the night my whole world shattered. I remember the way Daniel stood up. His smile was faint, almost rehearsed. The clinking of champagne glasses still echoed around us when he spoke those words that no one expected. "I want a divorce." Imagine the silence that followed, like the calm after a sudden storm. The room, once warm and filled with joy, felt cold and heavy. Friends froze, mid-sip eyes darting between us in disbelief. Our children, Thomas and Jennifer, stared wide-eyed, unable to comprehend what they'd just heard. And me, I was the center of it all. The wife, the mother, the woman who had spent every ounce of her strength supporting her family for 25 years. What did I do? I simply nodded. Not because I was defeated, but because I had already made peace with this moment long before it arrived. Daniel expected tears. He expected begging, pleading, maybe even a scene. But I offered none of that. I stood tall, held my composure, and spoke to our guests with gratitude for their presence, for witnessing what had become our final celebration together. This calm wasn't born from indifference. It was the product of a silent storm I had weathered inside months of quiet preparation, of gathering strength and resolve. You see, this wasn't the first time my world was rocked by Daniel's choices. I had discovered cracks months ago, cracks I chose not to ignore. And by the time he dropped his bombshell, I was ready not to be broken. My story isn't about a broken marriage. It's about survival, about reclaiming your power when everything seems lost. If you're facing betrayal, heartbreak, or an unexpected ending, listen closely. You can emerge stronger than ever before. So come with me. Let me tell you how I turned my darkest night into the dawn of a new life. 25 years. A quarter of a century spent building a life together. That's what I told myself every day as I watched Daniel supported him and made sacrifices I believed were necessary. When we met, I was 30, full of dreams and hopes. Daniel was 32, ambitious and promising. Our love was a whirlwind, fast, passionate, and filled with the kind of hope that only youth can carry. I remember the day we got married like it was yesterday. We promised to stand by each other through everything, the highs and lows, sickness and health, success and failure. I chose to step away from my career to raise our children, Thomas and Jennifer, to create a stable home where they could grow safely. I believed in our future, in our partnership. I was Daniel's biggest supporter through 3 different jobs, 2 financial crises, and 1 serious health scare. Late nights, weekend business trips, missed soccer games, and dance recitals. I told myself it was all part of the price to pay for the life we dreamed of. I convinced myself that love was enough to bridge the growing distance between us, even when I started feeling more like a roommate than a wife. Looking back now, I see the signs. I missed the cold looks, the harsh comparisons to other women he worked with, the gradual disappearance of intimacy. But at the time, I buried those doubts deep inside. Because after 25 years, you want to believe that the foundation you built is unshakable, that the love you nurtured is strong enough to survive anything. But sometimes love alone isn't enough. Sometimes the person you trusted most is the one who lets you down. And the harder you hold on, the more you risk losing yourself. This was my story, a story of love, sacrifice, and ultimately awakening. In every marriage, there are moments when silence speaks louder than words. For me, that silence grew heavier with each passing year. I began noticing the subtle changes, the way Daniel's eyes no longer searched for mine across the dinner table, the way his touch grew colder, more distant. But I told myself it was just stress, just the weight of life pressing down. There were nights when he'd come home late, smelling faintly of a perfume I didn't recognize. I found a second phone hidden in his briefcase once, but when I asked, he said it was for work. International clients he had to keep separate. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to hold on to the man I loved, the father of my children, the partner I had built a life with. I even told the kids, Your dad is working hard for all of us," hoping that reassurance would also convince myself. But deep down, I felt the cracks widening. The dinners he skipped, the phone calls he answered in whispers, the distance in his eyes. My friends would say, "Marriage changes after 20 years. It's normal to become more like roommates." I clung to that explanation, hoping it was just a phase. Yet the signs I tried to ignore kept multiplying: perfume on his collar that wasn't mine, unexplained expenses, and the unmistakable feeling that I was no longer the center of his world. It's strange how denial works. It's like a shield that protects you from unbearable truths, but also blinds you to reality. I was living in that denial until the day I found the lease agreement. That was the moment the mask slipped, and I had to face the truth I'd been avoiding. That silent distance wasn't just a phase. It was a gulf that had been growing between us, one that neither of us knew how to cross anymore. It started with a simple task: filing our tax paperwork early one morning. I was looking for our property records when I found it tucked away between insurance documents and car titles, a lease agreement for an apartment in downtown Richmond. At first, I couldn't believe my eyes. I stared at the paper in disbelief. Daniel's signature was clear on the dotted line, dated just 2 months earlier. A sleek one-bedroom unit, expensive and secret. That moment felt surreal, as if I was watching someone else's life unfold before me. The man I had trusted, the man I had built a family with, was living a double life. Then, 2 days later during dinner, his phone lit up. I caught a glimpse of a series of messages with someone saved only as co-worker. But these weren't ordinary work texts. They were intimate, filled with plans and promises that weren't meant for me. Reading those messages was like a punch to the gut. The betrayal wasn't a momentary lapse. It was a carefully hidden reality that had been going on for at least 18 months. I felt a storm of emotions: shock, anger, heartbreak. But amid the pain, a quiet resolve began to grow. I knew I couldn't confront him yet. Not until I understood the full extent of his deception. I needed to gather evidence to protect myself and my children. That day, sitting in my car outside that apartment building, I was paralyzed, caught between wanting to scream to demand answers and needing to stay silent to strategize. The contrast was unbearable. Daniel had told me just weeks earlier that we needed to be careful with spending because the market's unstable. Yet here he was, signing a lease for a place that cost 1/3 of his monthly income, a place I had never heard of. In that moment, I realized the life I thought I knew was a carefully crafted illusion, and I was determined to uncover every hidden truth, no matter how painful. After the initial shock of discovery, I found myself at a crossroads. What was I going to do with this truth? Would I let it crush me, or would I rise above it? I sat in my car, heart pounding, torn between confrontation and silence. The urge to demand answers, to unleash my pain, was almost overwhelming. But I knew that reacting in anger or despair wouldn't protect me. It would only give Daniel more power over my life. So I made a choice. I would not be a victim. I would become a warrior. I realized that to reclaim my life, I had to be patient and strategic. I needed to gather every piece of evidence, every detail, every secret Daniel had kept from me. I knew the battle ahead wouldn't be easy. It would test every ounce of my strength, my patience, and my courage. But I was ready. I started to observe quietly, documenting his movements, his financial transactions, his communications. I became an investigator in my own life. At night, when the house was silent, I would pore over messages and documents, piecing together the truth like a puzzle. I also reached out to Rebecca Stone, one of the most formidable divorce attorneys in Virginia. She didn't just offer legal advice. She became my guide, my ally, my shield. Rebecca taught me to think like a strategist, to keep my cards close, to document everything meticulously, and most importantly, to never let Daniel know how much I knew. It wasn't about revenge. It was about survival, about reclaiming control over a life that had been quietly unraveling around me. I knew this was my moment to stand up, not just for myself, but for my children and for every woman who has ever been silenced by betrayal. Choosing strength over despair was the first step on a long journey, a journey I was determined to win. What followed was a silent war. On the surface, I was still the supportive wife, managing our home, attending social events on Daniel's arm, playing the part of the woman who believed in their marriage. But beneath that facade, I transformed into something else, a methodical investigator gathering every scrap of evidence I could find. I started with our finances. Daniel had always handled the investments, so I asked questions under the guise of wanting to learn. He laughed it off at first, but eventually shared contact details for our financial advisor. That was a turning point. The advisor, Harold Wilson, was hesitant at first, but when I mentioned my concerns, he opened up about unusual withdrawals totaling over $300,000 money moved into a company I'd never heard of, Griffin Consulting, LLC. It became clear that Daniel was siphoning money away, hiding assets to protect himself. I photographed every document, every transaction, noting dates, amounts, and patterns. Next, I accessed his email account using passwords he thought were secure, but had overlooked the obvious patterns tied to our family. What I found was more than I expected: plans for a new life and Charlotte emails with Jessica discussing a future that excluded me, flight itineraries for weekend trips he claimed were business golf outings. Each piece of evidence was a brick in the fortress. I was building a fortress to protect my rights and secure a future free from deception. Rebecca reminded me constantly, "You are not just fighting for a divorce. You're fighting to take back your life. Document everything, follow the money, and never let your guard down." This quiet war was exhausting physically and emotionally, but it was mine to win. With every file I saved, every message I printed, I grew stronger, more determined. Daniel thought he controlled the narrative, but I was writing my own story, one where I would not be the victim. There were nights when the weight of betrayal pressed so heavily on my chest that I struggled just to breathe. I replayed memories over and over, the smiles, the promises, the shared dreams, all suddenly twisted by the knowledge of lies and deception. The pain was suffocating. It was like a vice grip around my heart, squeezing the joy and hope right out of me. But in that storm of emotions, I discovered something unexpected, a reservoir of strength I never knew I had. I realized that pain, while inevitable, did not have to define me. I could let it break me, or I could use it to fuel my fight for justice and dignity. I reminded myself daily I was more than a betrayed wife. I was a mother, a woman with dreams and worth beyond this heartbreak. Slowly, piece by piece, I rebuilt my sense of self. I found courage in small victories, a phone call to my lawyer, a document secured, a plan laid out. The journey was far from easy. There were moments of doubt, tears shed in silence, and nights filled with lonely questions. But through it all, I held on to one truth: I would not be defeated. I would rise not just for me, but for my children, for my future. This storm was fierce, but it was forging me into someone stronger, wiser, and ready to reclaim her life. Daniel thought he had planned the perfect moment. Our 25th anniversary party, surrounded by friends and family, would be the stage for his big reveal. He believed he would control the narrative, appear as the honest husband doing the right thing after years of falling out of love. But he underestimated me. He didn't know that I had been preparing silently for months, building my case, gathering every piece of evidence, every secret. The invitations were sent to 60 of our closest friends and family. The ballroom was elegantly decorated, the string quartet softly playing in the background, and the atmosphere was filled with anticipation, though not the kind Daniel expected. As dinner progressed, I noticed Daniel's eyes flicking to his watch. More often, his practiced smile beginning to falter. I knew the timeline he'd planned with Jessica. The announcement would come after dinner, but before dessert, just enough time for him to make his exit while the guests were still there to support me. Then the moment came. Daniel stood, raised his glass, and with that rehearsed smile said the words that echoed through the room, "I want a divorce." There was a collective gasp. Jennifer dropped her champagne glass, shattering it on the floor. Thomas half stood, confusion and anger flashing across his face. Our friends stared, stunned and speechless. But me? I simply nodded, met Daniel's eyes, and said calmly, "I understand completely." He expected tears, pleas, a public breakdown, but instead I gave him calm acceptance and quiet strength. His confident facade cracked as he realized his plan was unraveling. The power had shifted, and I was holding the pen to write the next chapter. That night marked the end of one story, but also the beginning of another. One where I was no longer a victim, but a woman reclaiming her life on her own terms. The days after the anniversary party felt surreal. Daniel's carefully constructed plans crumbled swiftly. His lawyer reached out. Jessica left her job, and whispers of investigation and settlement talks filled the air. But for me, the real victory was something deeper than legal settlements or financial gains. It was the reclaiming of my dignity, my voice, my future. I didn't seek revenge. I sought fairness, respect, and the freedom to live authentically. The hardest lesson I learned was this: no matter how deeply you invest in someone else's life, you must never lose sight of your own worth. Betrayal can shatter trust, but it cannot destroy your spirit unless you let it. From the ashes of that broken marriage, I found myself stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace a new chapter. Daniel moved away, his life diminished by his choices. Jessica faded out of the picture. And I stepped into the light of my own rebirth. To anyone watching who feels lost, betrayed, or broken, your story isn't over. You have the power to rise, to heal, and to create a life beyond what you imagined. Hold on to hope. Prepare yourself. And when the time comes, stand tall and claim the future you deserve. Because sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of the greatest journey of all, the journey to becoming who you truly are.